We're sitting quietly in Mrs. Goldbach's class, about 30 of us, watching her write on the chalkboard. And it was very quiet. And then the very clear, distinct word, shit, came from somewhere. And Mrs. Goldbach had her chalk hand at the height pressed against the board, and she slowly turned and said, "Who said that word?" There was dead silence. And I think somebody pointed a finger, because the next thing I knew, my best friend, Richard Krinkle, stood up with his head down. Richard Krinkle was my best bud. We walked home every night. We did things normal 7-year-old boys do, like the time we were walking down the sidewalk and we decided that we wanted to see how fast and straight we could run down that sidewalk with our eyes closed. So I went first, and I'm running down the sidewalk, and I didn't feel any grass under my feet. I knew I was doing great, and then I just, bam, ran right into the side of a car, fell back in the street. And Richard and I thought that was the most hilarious thing, and as we ran away, we could hear the driver get out of the car cussing us up and down. And so here was Richard Krinkle, standing there with his eyes down, and Mrs. Goldbach said, "Did you say that word, Richard?" And he says, "Yes, Mrs. Goldbach." She says, "You come to the back of the class with me right now." So we watched Richard walk to the back of the class, followed by Mrs. Goldbach. And when they got back there, we turned, and Mrs. Goldbach looked and said, "Everybody in this class, turn around and face the front and do not look back." The next thing is we hear Mrs. Goldbach saying something so low we couldn't understand it. And the next thing, we heard this terrific cry and scream, and Richard, and Mrs. Goldbach says, "Now you get back to your seat." And Richard turns back, and he's on a run almost to his seat, and he sits down at his desk, he puts his head down, crying and sobbing, and it went on for a little while, but we sat there, didn't know what to do. Now, up until that point, I thought Mrs. Goldbach was a great teacher because she smiled a lot, she explained things great, and I really enjoyed being in the class. But the second thing that I really enjoyed was that she sat me next to the very perfect and most beautiful Linda Nunn. Linda Nunn had this long, flowing blonde hair that had a sheen to it. And I'd sometimes just look there so she couldn't see me, and I would look over just looking at her hair. And she was always dressed very neat. She smelled very nice. She had on these small glasses, and she always smiled, and we talked. And I knew after the first week that this was the girl probably for me for the rest of my life. Well, she did one thing every day. In art class, we were given a single sheet of 8.5 by 11 manila paper, and we had to crayon something on it. And every day, Linda Nunn would make this beautiful princess. Filled the whole sheet. This princess always had this yellow hair. She had like a triangular face, and Linda Nunn could draw the best arms. The arms would come down, and she had bare shoulders, and she had gloves up to her elbows, and always was holding a wand with a gold star at the top. She had a crown, and then Linda Nunn would put this fantastic gown on her, and a big flowing dress. And sometimes it would be green, sometimes it would be red or blue, and it always had two little slippers, points of slippers sticking out the bottom. And her finishing touch was that she would put swag draperies down the side of the paper. I just adored her. I mean, I look at my paper and I'm drawing a dog who looks like a big turd with sticks on it, or on sticks. Every day we got our papers back from the day before, and every day Linda Nunn's paper had a big red A on it, and mine had a big black C or C minus. Well, one day Linda Nunn and Mrs. Goldbach coincidentally were not in school. And when the substitute teacher handed us the manila paper, I sat down and I thought, I'm going to draw a princess just like Linda Nunn. And I colored her, and I couldn't do the arms very well, but the rest of it looked almost exactly like Linda Nunn, and I was really proud, handed it in. So when Mrs. Goldbach and Linda Nunn are back the next day, and Mrs. Goldbach hands the papers out, she mistakenly gives Linda Nunn my paper. And I said to Linda, I said, oh, that's mine. You like it? And then I put it down, and there was a big red A. That was great. As soon as Mrs. Goldbach had finished handing out the papers at the front of the room and walking back, all of a sudden I hear from Linda Nunn, oh, Mrs. Goldbach, Ronnie drew one of my princesses. Look what he did. And Mrs. Goldbach comes over and she looks at me, and I held up the paper, and she says, did you drew one of Linda Nunn's princesses? And I says, yes, Mrs. Goldbach. She says, Ronnie, you come to the back of the room with me. I followed her to the back of the room. She turned around and she said, class, look straight ahead, do not look back. And then she sat down on this little student wood oak chair. And she was hunched over, eye to eye with me, and she put her hand up, and she then said in a very low voice, don't you ever tell anybody about this. Then she took the flap of skin under my chin and she dug in with her nails and she shook my head as hard as she could, and I just screamed like I've never ever screamed before and just started bawling. And I walked back to my desk. I sat down, and for the rest of the day I was totally silent. Well, the irony of this story is that eventually Richard Krinkle married Linda Nunn. They had 4 beautiful children, been married 50 years. And I, however, have never been able to approach a blonde-haired woman in a bar or at a dance or any kind of a nightclub. And the third irony is that I have 2 very brunette ex-wives who were both elementary school teachers. Thank you.